To sign the bond ordinance concerning the issuance and payment of Clark County, Nevada general obligation limited tax stadium improvement bonds additionally secured by pledged revenues, Series 2018A, and Clark County, Nevada general obligation limited tax stadium improvement bonds additionally secured by pledged revenues, Series 2018B, taxable in the maximum amount of $750 million as if an emergency exists. Mr. Chairman, I have Ms. Colvin who will provide a brief summary of the bonds.
Ms. Colvin, and we've got a lot of support people in the audience, and I'm sure we'll be happy to answer questions that you might not be comfortable with, but I'm sure you can handle all of them. So,
yes,
it's yours.
The Clark County Stadium Authority recently made all of the required determinations and findings under Senate Bill 1 and has requested Clark County to issue up to $750 million in general obligation revenue bonds additionally secured by room tax revenues for the construction of a 65,000-seat stadium. The findings have been filed with the clerk. These bonds are structured to mature over 30 years with escalating debt service and a debt service coverage ratio of 1.5 times. The bond issue will fund a debt service reserve fund equal to 1 year of average annual debt service. In addition, available room tax revenues in the future will fund an additional reserve to ultimately achieve a debt service reserve fund equal to 2 years of average annual debt service. The attached bond ordinance presented to you for approval is in compliance with Senate Bill 1.
Okay. Do we have any questions of Ms. Colvin? Seeing none. Yes?
I'll start. Jessica, thank you for your patience and going through this with me. And I don't think anybody questions where I'm at on this issue with regard to the bonding. So there is a reserve fund that's been established, correct? Do you want to walk through how that works?
Yes, Commissioner. With this bond issue, we will issue enough bond proceeds to fund 1 year of average annual debt service, and that will equate to approximately $45 million. Then going forward through the flow of funds that is outlined in Senate Bill 1 as well as in this bond ordinance, is to the extent that there is $9 million available in room tax revenues after the payment of debt service as well as the administrative fees, the $2 million as outlined in Senate Bill 1, the $9 million will be deposited in a second reserve. That will continue until the stadium is substantially completed. Once the stadium is substantially completed, then there is one additional tier that the available room tax revenues can be used for, and that's before the $9 million is used to fund this second reserve. And that is in the event if the operator either non-performs under the lease or breaches the lease. In that event, the available room tax revenues could be used to cure that breach. We have written into this ordinance that before the available room tax revenues in that year can be used, that any amounts that have been accumulated in the capital projects fund that's maintained by the stadium authority, those funds must first be depleted. Obviously, the intent for the county is to fund that second reserve as quickly as possible, and so that $9 million will continue until we reach the 2 years of average annual debt service, and we currently estimate that will be in 2022.
And then the estimated completion date for the 30-year payoff is 2039?
No, 2048.
And then there's also an allowance for there's a non-relocation agreement that's established, and it speaks to they can leave at any point in the last 7 years. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I cannot. I'm going to ask Mr. Aguero to speak to the non-relocation agreement.
If I could ask Jeremy and Guy might want to be down a little more towards the front because we might have questions, and anybody else on the bond stuff, well. No, you go and then we'll do public hearing. We'll go.
Jeremy.
With your permission, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner June Kiliani, there is a non-relocation agreement. That non-relocation agreement essentially allows for the team to have conversations with other groups during the last period of that non-relocation. It simply allows for a transition. It does not let them out of the non-relocation agreement.
So I have the document, but the non-relocation agreement really speaks to the stadium authority and then the relationship with Teamco, I guess is the terminology that they use. Stanco. Well, Teamco's representatives is what they're referencing in most of the articles. And so they can't, and I believe when I looked at Oakland's, they didn't have a non-relocation agreement, but there's still money that's owed to Oakland itself. So what would happen here if they decided to have a conversation with somebody about selling the team, buying the team, or something along those lines?
Sure. Commissioner Giunciliani, the purpose of the non-relocation agreement is the commitment by the Raiders to stay in Southern Nevada for 30 years. The non-relocation agreement itself is between the Stadium Authority Board and Teamco, or the Raiders. It essentially says that in the event that they leave, the Raiders leave the community, they are responsible to pay the non-amortized amount of the outstanding debt that is initially issued. So if they were to leave in year 5 or they were to leave in year 2, whatever the amount of the outstanding debt is as originally issued, they would be responsible to pay as a penalty as a result of that. There are specific provisions in there that talk about who they can talk to and when they can talk to them. I believe that's what you were originally speaking to. And essentially, there is a period at the end of any term where the team is going to have to start having conversations about the potential to move. And I think that's what you were referencing earlier. In terms of exactly what the provisions are in Oakland, I would not be able to comment on that today.
Okay. And then, so they could leave early, but they'd be responsible for paying off the bond.
They would be responsible for the non-amortized amount of the debt. So yes, that would be correct.
And if there's not enough money in the reserve or the capital fund, then how do we recoup those costs?
So let's imagine a situation where they leave in year 5. The money has all been expended. The stadium is operating. There would then be a penalty associated with that, where they would be responsible for paying the non-amortized amount of that debt. That is not a responsibility of any debt fund. That is the responsibility of the Raiders, not the public. The bonds themselves would be prepaid by the same security that Ms. Colvin talked about previously, which is the room tax revenue. And to the extent that the room tax revenue was insufficient to make the principal and interest payments, you would have both the first year reserve that would be funded at the point the bonds are issued, and then hopefully by that time the second year reserve, which would essentially secure those monies. There's a provision within that non-relocation agreement that essentially says in the event that that penalty is paid to the stadium authority, those monies will be used directly delivered directly by the county to actually retire that debt.
But it could be, if we have a downturn, unfortunately, like what happened before, there could be a shortage as far as being able to pay that if they decided to relocate.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, there's always the potential of having room tax revenues come in under expectations. However, I would suggest that the analysis that's been provided and utilized in these bonds would reflect a relatively conservative approach, an appropriately conservative approach to bond issuance. The bonds are dependent upon the expectation of a 2% growth rate in that room tax going forward, which is substantially less than what we've seen historically. In addition to that, with a 1.5 times coverage, Southern Nevada could essentially weather a downturn roughly equivalent to what we saw during the Great Recession and continue to pay those bonds. As a matter of fact, including the reserves, you could essentially have a negative growth rate over a 30-year period and still repay those bonds.
And then you spoke to penalties. What exactly are the penalties? It speaks to liquidated damages, not as a penalty. I'm not sure exactly within the agreement.
Sure. Perhaps there may be in some areas where it's not entirely clear, but the penalty itself is the unamortized amount of the debt. So whatever the principal amount is that's left on that debt is continued and needs to be repaid. In the event that Senate Bill 1 specifically allows for debt, for example, to be retired early, for example, but the Raiders do not get the benefit